Okay, well down in the nose of the aircraft you have a bomb aimer's position. There would normally be a couch on the floor for him to lay down on, but that's removed so that the visitors don't destroy it. Basically the navigator's job was to use that low-level bomb sight to drop torpedoes from 500 feet should they have some sort of swirl or sign where a submarine's just dived. And above that you have the gunner's position. There were two 20mm cannon could be fitted either side of the gunner's feet actually, and there are large ammunition tanks on both sides of the nose, each of which could carry 300 rounds. So basically you had 600 rounds of 20mm cannon ammunition, and then below that you've got the stowage for smoke markers marine. They are smoke markers that are fairly long duration. In fact, they are not the ones we used to carry in the Shackleton. They are very similar but not quite accurate, I have to confess, on behalf of the museum. And there is a flare chute just by the first pilot's feet, just around the corner on the left, where they would be fired from. I don't know whether you can see it from there, but yeah, that's it. And the controls are actually in the cockpit here for that. So that's basically the nose. Nice quiet position, and a position I was when I had my 2 hours off, because on most long sorties the pilots would share the flying, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. And if I had nothing to do, or we'd had a fairly heavy night the night before, I would go and lay down in the nose on the bomb aimer's couch and just have a little rest, shall we say. Give the Shackleton very nice moulded perspex canopy with excellent visibility to the sides. As you can see, not much view ahead, but the gunner would have the main ahead lookout if we were doing something like search and rescue, so we would always man the gun turret even if we didn't have guns, purely for the lookout. But anyway, the flight deck is not typical of a four-engined aeroplane, because you would normally have a console in here with the throttles, etc., but that is not possible because the navigators have to gain access to the bomb aimer's position. So each pilot has his own set of throttles and RPM levers at the side. They're the only controls for the main engines. The flight engineer's got the rest. RPM levers because they are constant speeding propellers, so you set the RPM and then basically you open the throttle fully to give you the power, which is in itself limited by the RPM you set. So that's how we would fly. By after takeoff we would reduce the RPM to perhaps 2000 RPM and then open the throttles fully, and you would end up with cruising speed. And then as time went on you would gradually reduce the RPM at 25 RPM a time, just to maintain your best range speed, as we called it, the best, most efficient use of the fuel to get you from A to B. Normal blind flying panel, 1, 2, 3, 4 of 5 of the instruments you would normally have. The 6th one has been slightly removed up to the right there, because we have two different gauges here. ILS indicator, as it very obligingly says, and this is the device which is a very early flight director for those who are familiar with pilot instrumentation. It's called a zero reader actually, and the control unit is over on the co-pilot side, and so that he could set up the heading you were required to fly, the pitch angle, or it could lock it to any altitude. You could also lock it to the ILS, so you got a demand instrument similar to a flight director. Providing you kept that instrument crossed in the middle, you were doing the flight path that was being pre-selected for you on the controller. Other things you have, another cross instrument here, that is the Sonar Buoy Homer. I mentioned the aerials on the wings earlier when we were outside, and that is the Homer that you would use to home back on top of a sonar buoy that the navigator dropped for tactical purposes. You also have the radio compass and the radar altimeter, that the new one fitted in the bulge under the tail, which gives you a very accurate height, but as you can see only up to 500 feet. We're not really bothered about accurate height above 500 feet. The pressure altimeter is quite adequate for that. Various system switches on here which are very much in-house, probably not worth commenting on in detail, apart from you'll see there are two release buttons on the control column here. the N release button, which is not exactly a great leap of imagination to believe that's the nuclear release, and the conventional release on the other side with a C on it. Best not to get them mixed up. And then you've also got a little steering wheel on the left hand side here, which is just for steering the nose wheel when you're on the ground. So the main controls and then nose wheel steering. Ashtrays on the control columns, of course, because in the 60s everybody smoked. In the middle you have the main engine RPM gauges, give you tells you what each engine is doing, and you have the 2 RPM gauges for the Viper jet engines. Pilots don't actually have any controls for the Viper jet engines, and so they're all in the engineer's position, which we'll see in a minute. But the manifold pressure gauges here for the Griffons, you can see 67 inches was the normal takeoff full power, and then if you had water methanol injection you could go up to 80 inches, which is the other end of that eye-catching paper insert in the gauge there. Nuclear safety locks, and this is the emergencies panel. 4 feathering buttons for the engines to feather the propellers, fire extinguishers for the engines and the Vipers, and the fuel master cocks, which are the equivalent to the idle cut-off of a smaller aeroplane, and they were just the main fuel cock to that particular engine. An accelerometer here to so that you could see how much G you were pulling, which was only like about 2 in a Shackleton, I'm afraid. It's not an aerobatic aeroplane. And on the roof panel you have the ignition switches for the engines, 2 magnetos for each engine, of course. The autopilot controller, which is one of the reasons that the aeroplane was always flown from this seat, because the autopilot controls are actually in the left hand, the right hand armrest there, and the selectors up here. And you have a UHF radio, a VHF radio, the old-fashioned crystal control pre-selected one, and also a radio compass controller there, plus a second VHF there. Should be a compass hanging there, but because this aircraft's open to the public, we're not allowed to have that compass hanging down there because it's slightly radioactive. Now, I've sat this distance away from them for 2,000 hours, and you can make your own judgment as to whether it's affected me, but I feel that 5 minutes the public in here are not going to harm them too much unless they actually eat the thing, but we have to take it out for radiation control, health and safety. So there we are. Oh, didn't mention this little panel here, the flaps. You can have 2 selections of flaps, takeoff and full, nothing fancy. You've got the bomb doors there, open and closed, and you have these 2 doll's eyes there, the one indicating whether the bomb doors are open and closed, the other one whether the ASV is retracted, and it should be black at the moment because the ASV being the search radar radome that you saw at the back, and that should be up, and also the undercarriage selector up and down. This little device here is what they call a synchroscope, and basically number 2 is the number 1 is the, on the Nimrod it's number 2, on this aircraft it's number 1 is the master engine, and so that gives you the speed of the engine, fast or slow, comparative to number 1. That's important because this is a very noisy aeroplane, and you don't need to make it any noisier by not having the propellers synchronized. If the engines are synchronized, you get a nice constant roar rather than beat frequencies going and being very annoying. So the co-pilot's main job when he was, or the pilot sitting in the right hand seat's main job was to keep the engines synchronized so that the crew were happy and we got a nice noise. Right, I think that's it. I'll now try to get out of the cockpit again. Just behind the flight deck you've got the air engineer's position. There are no computers in this airplane, so everything is manual. At the top here you've got electrics basically. The aircraft is a DC aircraft, 24 volt DC system with generators on the engines rather than more modern alternators, and we had to convert things with inverters to get AC to run the flight instruments, etc, etc. And this particularly, you've got things like Bombay temperature. In general terms, the engine instruments are all down there with the charge temperature the oil pressure, oil temperature, and then you have pneumatic gauges here for the emergency. You can put emergency undercarriage, emergency flaps, etc., and emergency bomb doors open and close, so that you can, if you have a hydraulic failure, you can operate them pneumatically. Heaters, such as they were down the middle there, they were pretty ineffective. De-icing, as it says there, for pumping out fluid out of the leading edges of the wings and tailplane to combat icing. Unfortunately not very effective, which led to the loss of an aeroplane and Loch Aylort in 1967. And hence, when we see the back of the aeroplane, you'll find that all the trim has been stripped out to save weight, to avoid that problem. And then you finally the fuel tanks, which were critical to the aeroplane. You have 6 tanks in each wing, plus the capability of carrying a drop tank in the bomb bay for another 400 gallons. So you could get away with about 4,600 gallons maximum. Basically, the tanks filled the whole wing forward of the controls. So the number 1 tank's between the fuselage and the inboard engine. The number 2 tank is between the 2 engines, and then the 3, 4, 5 group are joined together. They are outboard of the outboard engine towards the wingtip, and finally you have the wingtip tanks. So those are the gauges you have, and all the booster pumps for each tank, and also the cocks for opening and close it are there, so you could actually feed any engine from any tank. The pilots had a working knowledge of this panel purely because the engineer's a single guy, and you know, if he keeled over, we were supposed to know what all these things did. Well, I won't say that I could say then. I can tell you more now, having had another 30 years or so of looking at it. Every hour the engineer would fill in a log similar to this one I prepared here, and it would give you basically mainly interested in the fuel, but also the engine temperatures, etc., and the fuel contents both sides, and he would log significant events in the sortie along there. When we come to the add-on extras, the Viper engines that we saw outside, we had a bit of a problem. I haven't mentioned them on here at all. I mentioned fire extinguishers up there, and I said the controls were at the engineer's position. The problem was no panel left, so ta-da, the Viper gauges are all in the engineer's desk. And this was made a detachable lid of perspex so that he could actually operate them, and then if he wanted to fly long term with them working, you could close that so he could put his log down on top, but normally he would operate it with this often so he could get his hands in there easy. And originally they just had on-off switches effectively, which was idle or full power, but latterly we had inching switches on the throttle, so we could actually use the Vipers to cruise, but you could only use them for up to 3 hours above idle for either engine. And so we would tend to use them in turn, because with 4 Griffons and a Viper, that was enough to get you up to the limiting speed of the Viper doors, which was 200 knots. So although it was a wonderful system, if you put both Vipers on, you couldn't throttle the Griffons back far enough to maintain the speed below the limit for the doors. So there we are. Opposite the engineer you have the wireless operator's position. Now, we were always in contact with our maritime headquarters in the UK, and it was this guy's job to use the HF radio. There are big wire aerials on the roof which are connected to this, which is the STR-18. For the people who know about radios, that's an HF radio. I'm a pilot, it's an STR-18. We also had an AD118, which is just a receiver, which we could use mainly to tune in the light program and things like that, but you could use it for other purposes as well. And of course the main communication system was dots and dashes, Morse code. We used to code up our messages into something very much like an Enigma machine that was used in World War II to produce a message in 5-letter groups, and then he would send it out on HF to the world. The main thing was that every hour he would contact, in plain language, he would contact the maritime headquarters to say that we were all safe and well, and they would send back the forecast pressure settings for the areas we were operating in, and we had that exchange every hour just for safety reasons. If it didn't happen, of course, the search and rescue crew would be brought to readiness, and after a certain period they would be launched to go and find out what happened to you, which was always comfort to us. You've also got things like the IFF there, the old-fashioned identification of friend or foe system, and each position you've seen, you've probably seen them on in the corner of other shots. There are this box which is basically the communications, the intercom system within the aircraft, and you have various options depending on the position as to what facilities you can listen to and transmit on. So everybody's slightly different, but the box is virtually the same. Right, now we come to the navigators. I say again that this is not a digital aeroplane, so all this, think of a mobile phone and the GPS and the computing capability, and this doesn't do anything like as much for you. However, it's all we had at the time. You have a very accurate analog system which takes your air position and then applies a wind to it, so you get a ground position. And once again, I'm a pilot, so the intricacies are somewhat lost on me, but basically it requires you to know your drift. So just as an aside, you've got a drift recorder here which you can look down and you can actually see the path of the aircraft or the path of the ground going below the aircraft, and adjust the lines so that you get a drift, left or right, and that the nav can apply that to the heading to produce your track. The same thing is done automatically by the Blue Silk radar, which we saw the aerial of earlier, and this is the indicator for that. It gives you not only drift, but it gives you ground speed as well, and that was used to feed both the nav system and to stabilize the radar display, so that the radar was actually a map with the aircraft moving over it, rather than the origin always staying in the middle and the time base just going round. That was because obviously if you had a submarine and it dived, you wanted that position to be a proper geographical position, and so that when the radar marked it with a chinograph or whatever, he could then drive the airplane to that position and you would be at the position where the submarine was, all driven really by the nav system, particularly the track and ground speed of the Blue Silk. It also fed these two projectors here, one for the routine navigator, one for the tactical navigator. They're called GPI-1, GPI-1B and 1C. This one's got a wind, you can add the wind manually if you want to, that one you can't. And we would have a map, a local area map, very similar to this one, which shows St Morgan, but probably more orientated with St Morgan in the middle. And there's a little projector in the bottom of this display which displays an arrow on the map, and that arrow will move with the track and ground speed of the aeroplane, so you have a very primitive animated display of your position at all times, but required resetting quite often because of inbuilt inaccuracies in the system. And also, of course, when you got to an area in the sea, you wouldn't have a map, you just have lat and long on a chart, so that you'd enter the area, the nav would set the GPI going, plot all the radar contacts manually, and then devise a way to go around the area to view all the contacts to decide what you've got in your area and what you want to do about it. Also, of course, they would use aeronautical charts, the en route charts as we call them, for high level navigation. Should we ever get into airways, they're all marked on here with all the beacons and etc. Similar to today, really, that's just a slightly old one. So that's the routine navigator. His job was to be in charge of the geographic position of the airplane and basically keep situational awareness of what's going on in the world. The tactical navigator, on the other hand, was purely the tactical coordinator, the attack manager, if you like. He had a chart here, like a dartboard, and if the radar had a contact which disappeared, for instance, he thought it might be a submarine, he would report it, and then if the captain said, okay, we're going to go and investigate it, he would then start giving a radar homing, and the navigator would use that as his datum, and the radar would he would set up his little arrow so that it was coming in on wherever the radar was calling, and then when he got to the middle he would drop sonar buoys across that, because he has the sonar buoy selectors here and the weapons selectors above. even has the nuclear selectors up there, but that's a bit of overkill. I mean, basically we go in and drop buoys 2,000 yards either side of the datum where the submarine was, active, passive, active. Passive, active, passive. And then we would hope the submarine comes up with a sonar contact, and that would all be played out in chronograph lines on here, and the aircraft arrow would be wobbling around, and then the pilots would be called to go on top of the particular buoy in contact, because that was the best way of getting short-term accuracy. They would run out on the attack heading given by the navigator, and then he would release a weapon when he came to the attack to the submarine position based on his sonar information. I've mentioned several times the nuclear option. This was obviously very much a last-ditch solution to the Russian missile-firing submarines. They had developed conventional and then some nuclear submarines which could launch ballistic missiles to attack the UK directly. Much more so after the Shackleton, but still during the Shackleton's time that technology was in its infancy. The lucky thing was that the Russian submarines at that time had to surface to fire their missiles. They couldn't use like a Polaris, a submarine launch missile. And so we would have a chance on radar to detect them, and hopefully we could run in and deliver a quick attack with a really large weapon like a tactical nuclear weapon, purely to stop them bombing the UK. So this is, nuclear war would have already broken out, and we would be contributing not to starting World War III, but to hopefully making it as quick and as survivable as it could be. This is not a mushroom cloud type weapon. It goes down to, I think it was around 1,000 feet below the surface and then explodes. 11 kiloton warhead, so similar to the weapons used on Japan. But it basically came up with a large dome of water, and that was it. The massive overpressure under the surface, of course, was what was used to crack the submarine, or at least dissuade him from doing much operational anymore. You can see, well, perhaps you can't, but in this picture here, there's a similar weapon which is called ASROC. That's an American destroyer, and it's fired a rocket with a same nuclear warhead, different delivery system, and you can see the dome of spray there created by it exploding. So that was our nuclear technology. Okay, well, we've mentioned sonar. These are the two receivers for sonar buoys. We will see there's a sonar buoy down at the back of the aeroplane just for demonstration purposes. We carry up to 20 in the Bombay. Unfortunately, these guys could only monitor one active per set or two passives, so the maximum sonar buoys we could monitor at any one time was 4. So that was somewhat of a limitation, but it is a short-range system used purely to localize something that you've already detected on radar. It's not a search technology, it's an attack technology, really. And these cursors on the side here are connected by synchronous transmissions to what we call lighthouses, which are projectors underneath the glass table on the tactical navigator side, which is why that map looked awful and grey, and that was because it's tracing paper, so that you could see the bearings coming up from underneath the table, and the tactical navigator at least had a little bit of automation to help himself out, rather than purely having to do it with a piece of paper and a ruler. So we were getting there slowly, but still no digital technology involved whatsoever. Sonar system had a range. Passives are about 4,000 yards, actives out to about 2,000 yards, so not a massive amount. And you had 16 channels, radio channels if you like, so the buoys didn't interfere with each other when you dropped them in the water. Changing subject entirely, this little recorder here is the recorder for the Autolycus system. Now, the Autolycus was a thief, son of Hermes, I believe, in mythology, but in The Winter's Tale in Shakespeare, it's described as the snapper-up of inconsidered trifles. And basically what it does is detects diesel exhausts. The ionisation of a diesel exhaust. The air is analysed. There's an intake on the nose of the aircraft which allows outside air to come in. It's analysed, and any ionisation would cause a peak in this graph, so that you could call an autologous contact, and then the nav would plot the signal in, signal out, and you could eventually work out the orientation, which is going to be somewhere down with the wind, or downwind of the submarine. And you could home on the diesel exhaust given off by the submarine snorkel. Ideal if in that he doesn't know you're coming because you're not transmitting on radar, be giving away no electronic information, so his lookouts are the only people that are going to detect you. The bad thing is, of course, that in peacetime, particularly to practice with it, every single diesel ship in the ocean produces a trail, and so while you could practice on ships, it wasn't thought to be very effective anywhere where there's any amount of shipping at all. And in fact, it went forward into the Nimrod, as did this sonar system and the radar, but it was taken out of the Nimrod at a very early stage because it was deemed that the Russians weren't building any new diesel electric submarines for a start, so no targets, and secondly it was a waste of time. Okay, yeah. Shared piece of equipment here called, in this case it says ECM on it, but that's old parlance. It's what would be called a radar warning receiver, or ESM these days, electronic support measures. Basically it's a receiver which scans the radar band and gives you a bearing on this minuscule cathode ray tube of any radar which is actually illuminating the Shackleton at the time. And also the signal, the radar's PRF etc. frequency will be shifted down so that the operator could hear it in his headset and therefore determine within very broad parameters what sort of radar it was, and whether indeed, if you got a steady bearing, of course it was locked onto you, which was very useful if you were passing a ship. You didn't want them particularly to lock onto you with their anti-aircraft weapons and things like that. It can be swung either side, which is why this arc is here, because if the radar was busy doing an effective radar search, he probably didn't have time to play with this as well. So the whole equipment would be swung round, and the guy sitting in second sonics would be the ESM operator. The radar would normally be secluded in his little tent, which is attached to the wall here, so that would come all the way round so that there wasn't any light on the screen, and he would do his 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever, concentrating on the radar search, because that was our primary sensor. It's called ASV21, and it has a maximum range of 170 miles, but that was obviously tactically not very useful. You could fix on land if you were high enough to see it that far out. We use mainly 36, 72 mile scales because the snorkel, I keep using abbreviations, I'm sorry, be visible out to about 15 miles in average sea conditions, perhaps a periscope out to 12 miles, but a ship out to the radar horizon. So if you're 1,000 feet, you'd see ships at 45 miles, that sort of thing. And we'd use tactics. We wouldn't just have it going round and round all the time. You would sector scan. If the strong wind particularly, you would put it on a sector scan and scan that downwind so that you were looking away from all the nasty sea returns, and you get a better detection range. Or we'd go intermittent if we were trying to surprise a submarine, and we would go an intermittent all-round scan, and the navigator would use a random tracks technique, so he would select random points in the area and combine that with radar on and off, so that people, we could try to surprise people up to no good, i.e. submariners. The actual controls for the scanner are there. You can see the 4 positions up. First search, second search, and attack. And at attack, the scanner is about 9 feet below the fuselage, which allows it to see past the bomb doors, which will be open ahead of it, of course. The reason it's indicated there is because that causes quite a bit of drag, so the radar would always ask permission to move the scanner to any position other than up, because of the handling minor but could be critical drag effects on the airplane. Notice perhaps there's a lot of bone domes hanging up around here. The crew would wear them as a vote of confidence to the pilots for takeoff and landing, but pilots, we tended to wear our bone domes the whole time because it's quite easy for a seagull to come and join you in the cockpit if you're flying at around about 500 feet, 1,000 feet, which is their normal patrol height. But these guys would hang them up and just wear the cloth in a helmet while they were on to task. I don't know how they managed to do that, because it was definitely enough with a bone dome on. And that really is the end of the tactical area. We're just about seen all the technology in the Shackleton, such as it is. The nerve centre of the aeroplane here, of course, is the galley. Careful. Yep. This is the rapid water boiler, teas and coffees to the world, sink, meal preparation area, ring. They had a infrared grill in there, oven in here, fan oven, 6 shelves, so half the crew could have a pie at the same time. And these were refrigerated containers where we would carry our rations, and latterly, when they'd been invented, we could have frozen meals. But before, we didn't have things like credit cards and frozen meals that people take for granted were not available in the days this aeroplane was flying. This is the drinking water tank, and on a very long sortie you could actually get short. So if we were thinking that we might be on an extended sortie, quite often carried a jerry can with water in it, and you could pump it with a wobble pump into that thing to refill your water tank. Bunks. If you carried the minimum or normal crew of 10, you didn't have spare people a lot of the time, so these weren't used for lying around having a sleep. Basically, in my crew, we flew just as it's shown here, without the photographs of course, just 2 bunks in use as a settee, and then the top bunk we put all our hats and lightweight equipment, headset bags, things that didn't matter if they fell off. And that was how the ground crew used to travel quite often. We could have 2 or 3 ground crew there, or in the dinette here, which is the dining room if you like, you could get a couple of guys sitting in there as well. And if you looked at them hard and long enough, they'd probably make you a cup of coffee, which was always nice. So there we are. That's the, as I say, the nerve centre of the aeroplane. The reason why Coastal Command was also known as Eating Command. And then, while I was at the engineers panel, I talked about the electrics of the aeroplane, saying it was a 24 volt system which used generators, so there wasn't a lot of electricity being produced. So we couldn't have a big searchlight like the Nimrod had to illuminate contacts at night. Basically, we had these 1.75 inch recce flares. That's obviously a beam fired. Quite a lot. I haven't bothered to count them, but 150 something I suspect. And you've got 4 6-barreled launchers under here, which fire out of the side of the aeroplane. So you had 24 flares loaded at any one time at night, and that was the beam operator at the back here's job, was to keep the flares loaded up. And then on a radar homing, if the pilots didn't report anything visual, because obviously a ship would have lights on at night, we would, at 1 mile on the radar homing, the radar would call 1 mile flares, and the flares would be launched on a timer. Careful, there's a step there. The would release using that button there. That's the flare release, and they go off at 1 second intervals. So you get effectively 4 flares in the air at any one time. They fired out of the side, went below the level of the aircraft, and then illuminated the water to ahead and to the right. And all the guys on the right hand side would be looking out to see what this contact was, and the pilot in the left hand seat would be flying on instruments to make sure he wasn't dazzled by the flares. So that was the only system we had for illuminating a contact at night. And of course, it could be a submarine, could be an oil drum or a log. So basically, they earned their money, and it was something akin to the Battle of Trafalgar back here when you were doing night bombing, because for practice, because there'd be cordite smoke all over it. When you released anything, you then had photo flashes, which are a similar size but much more dangerous, and they went out of the top here to provide a flash for the attack camera that I talked about when we were outside. So say something like HMS Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. And on the OCU, we young pilots used to have to come back here and watch the guys and help them and the T4s to do that, so that we got an appreciation, all part of the crewmanship deal, for what their job was. Beam lookouts here, these 2 seats, very comfy, nicest, probably the nicest, most comfortable position in the aeroplane, because it's furthest from the engine, so quieter. Even though All the soundproofing was removed as part of the modification to help with the tailplane icing, so that we didn't get ice under the tailplane. Nevertheless, still a nice area. They had a camera back here, a handheld camera, and you could open these windows. I will demonstrate just to prove it. There we go. Open the window like that, and then you could take shots out, providing you didn't stick the nose of the camera outside the airframe, which of course could cause a nasty thump as it hit the back of the window. But you got about 160 knot breeze going past out there. So they've either, normally this side actually, because the left hand seat pilot will be flying it. You've also got mounting for an astro compass there, so that they could take fixes on lighthouse and things, do a running fix for the navigator if he was clutching at straws. And under here you've got a 6-barrel flame float launcher. We haven't got any because they're pyrotechnics, but they're just about the size of that cardboard tube. They were stowed here, and they burnt with smoke and flame for 6 minutes. So that was our initial mark. Of anybody saw anything they didn't recognise or were worried about or wanted to investigate, they would press the flame float release at each window position. There's one there, and they would that would immediately drop a flame float from that. If that didn't go, you have a reversionary mode where you pull that open. It's just a tube, and you throw one out manually out of the floor. The another point of interest there. The binoculars are not original, by the way. The hooter that was used to call people to action stations, just like you see in the films of submarines. You know, action station. Because obviously people might be walking around down here, particularly without the headset on, and so if you needed to get hold of somebody quickly, you did call action stations, and they'd all rush and plug in and find out what was going on. And this finally in the dark here is the blue silk, which is that track and ground speed of Doppler radar, which is used to provide track and ground speed for the navigator. And that was a late addition. This all used to be wardrobe at one time. A nice collage by the Shackleton Association. There are all the squadrons that use Shackletons in their 40-year career in the Air Force. And this black and orange thing here is a Sonar buoy. That was the height of miniaturization in 1960s. It's called a 1C Sonar buoy. It's say 16 channels. That one happens to be number 12 because it says so on the sign. And it had a range of about 4,000 yards as a passive buoy, and you could drop an active buoy which had a range of about 2,000 yards. They were directional, so the reason the active range is a lot shorter is because obviously the buoy steps around the compass to give you a bearing, and so it wouldn't be waiting for the echo. Then you've got the toilet basically in the tail lookout position, and I'm afraid a lot of the museum's towels are drying there because this aircraft does leak quite a lot. And you see there the tailplane going where it says low headroom, the tailplane going through the middle of the fuselage or the top of the fuselage. The main flying controls come down to the tailplane through this tube here, which runs all the way from the cockpit all the way down to torque tubes just below the tailplane. Same with as we were going forward and backwards, you may have caught a glimpse of the big things we climbed over there, the main wing spars. Showing the Avro Lancaster Lincoln heritage in that the main wing spars go through the middle of the fuselage to allow the bomb bay to be clear for all combinations of weapons, sonar buoys and survival gear, whatever we were carrying. And that really is the inside of a Shackleton.
Well, thanks very much, Brian, for showing us around.